Hi, and welcome back to Democracy Cracks. In this mini-series, we examine the fractures in our democratic systems and what we need to do to heal them. In the last episode, we talked about what happens when trust collapses, how people walk away, how polarization grows, and how new forms of engagement can appear. So today, we're zooming in on a very specific moment of democratic life. Election day. That ritual where you step into a booth, mark a choice, and hope it changes something. And yet, how many of us have done this thinking that, anyway, it doesn't matter? Or they even skipped an election for the exact same reasons. This is where a problem appears. In representative democracies, we elect people to act on our behalf. That means that democracy depends on participation. So, if people are not participating, are democracies doomed? By now, you know me. I'm not here to drown you in pessimism. So I can anticipate that there is a twist. In this episode, we'll look at what the ballot box still means today and at other forms of participation that are quietly gaining ground. Because what if we're not seeing the end of participation, but actually a diversification of how people take part in politics? When it comes to elections, we often tell ourselves a very simple story. If people care, they vote. If they don't, they stay home. And sure, turnout has been declining in many places. You might remember the striking number we talked about in the previous episode. Globally, the average turnout has dropped by around 10 percentage points since the 1990s. But as always, when you look a little closer, the reality becomes much more complicated. And let's be honest, also much more interesting. Because people don't vote or do vote for very different reasons. And not voting does not automatically mean not caring. This is an important point we already made. And as Daniela explained, trust is part of the picture, but not the whole story.
In some cases, you can see that high levels of trust translate and also in high levels of political participation, but it's definitely not the only reason why citizens participate in an election. It's not because, okay, I have high levels of trust and then I vote or I turn out in an election, because there are so many different other reasons why you would turn out in an election or not. It's one of the determinants, but not the main determinant.
And this is backed up by ActEU research. One of the points that really stuck with me is that abstention doesn't come with a note explaining why. People can stay home out of frustration, protest, practical constraints, or simply because they think their vote won't count. All of this can coexist. Voter turnout isn't falling in the same way everywhere or for everyone. Across Europe, it's younger people, those with lower incomes, and people with less formal education who are much more likely to stay home on election day, while older and richer citizens keep voting. One study by Matthew Polacco put some clear numbers on this. In countries with high inequality, nearly 9 out of 10 high-income voters turn out, compared to fewer than 8 out of 10 among the lowest income groups. But this isn't true everywhere. In places like Belgium and Australia, where voting is compulsory, the gap is tiny, while in countries like the United States or Poland, it's much wider. And crucially, when political parties offer clearly different economic policies, people on lower incomes are more likely to feel that voting is worth it, and they show up. But here is where it gets even more interesting. High turnout doesn't necessarily mean people are happy with democracy. Quite often, people vote because they're angry, worried, or trying to stop something they fear. In countries like Hungary, Greece, Italy, Spain, or Cyprus, low trust in politics often goes hand in hand with high turnout. All of this points to something important. People don't vote just for one reason. Turnout numbers alone can't tell us which emotion is driving participation. That's why understanding all these participation gaps is so important. Let's look more closely at some of them.
Climate is the political issue currently on the agenda where there's the starkest generational divide. People under the age of 30 are so much more aware and so much more desirous of radical action to tackle it than people over the age of 45. So the question is how to bring that intergenerational perspective into politics when a lot of young people are becoming really disaffected with politics. So at Bruegel, we worked with some polling and focus groups which looked more deeply into the attitudes of Europeans. And it's really striking how it's not socioeconomic status that determines how much you want to see climate action or even to take action yourself. Whether you're rich or poor, whatever's your income, people across Europe are really concerned about climate change, and the vast majority of them want more rapid action. But the big difference is between people who feel that politics can deliver a fair and effective transition and people who feel really disillusioned with politics and who feel that governments can't really get a grip on the situation and can't deliver effective climate action. And that disillusionment is what I think is driving a lot of the vote for extremist parties, especially those that criticize green measures and even deny that climate change is happening.
What Heather is describing is now well established. It's not socioeconomic status or age that predicts whether someone cares about climate change or not. It's whether they believe politics can deliver a fair transition. And when young people feel politics can't, many don't walk away from participation altogether, but they can walk away from elections. So yes, some citizens are withdrawing from traditional participation, but other forms of participation are stepping up. And that's where I want to take you next. If voting is only one part of political participation, where do people go if they abandon the ballot box, but not their political voice? Maybe the center of gravity of political participation is shifting. But let's be honest, it makes sense. Elections happen only a couple of years apart, and in parallel, our lives move at the speed of a push notification. For many people, especially younger generations, political engagement now happens in between elections, with petitions, in comment sections, through online campaigns, in the streets, or in completely new formats that didn't exist a decade ago. According to the 2024 Eurobarometer survey, 48% of young Europeans report having taken action to change society in the last year. In Romania, for example, it goes up to 57%. Moreover, engaging on social media was for young people the second most effective action to make their voice heard. Online spaces let people react in real time, faster than electoral cycles, faster than institutions can keep up, and sometimes faster than democracy can absorb. But this doesn't mean young people are apathetic. Quite the opposite. When Alex told me about ActEU's Youth Democracy Labs, I could really feel his cautious optimism.
And I can maybe refer to the Youth Democracy Labs. So we kind of brought together in small interactive workshops high school students or also university students to discuss exactly these issues: hate, trust, polarization, and what can we do against it. And first of all, I saw that these people were highly interested in politics and in being heard and in participating. And at the same time, very frustrated about how we approach the young generation and specifically political education.
So young people care deeply, and especially about issues like cost of living, climate, job, health. But they often feel a disconnect between calls emphasizing the importance of their voices and the actual limited influence they can have on decision-making. So it's only natural that when the system can't keep up, new forms of participation emerge. Some governments are trying to respond by creating new democratic institutions built for long-term thinking. Heather mentioned one of my favorite examples.
It's not so much there's a problem with democracy per se as the representatives of the people actually represent is the problem. Now, there are ways around this. For example, there are countries that have appointed a commissioner for the future or a commissioner for future generations who represents the interests of people who haven't been born yet and who brings a longer term perspective into policymaking. A good example of this is Wales, which is part of the United Kingdom, which has such a commissioner. So it's possible to create institutions which fill this gap. But of course, they need to have, appropriate powers and decision-making authority for that function to be effective. Another way of trying to deal with this is the way that some of the courts have tried to do this. So, for example, the German Constitutional Court a few years ago issued a ruling on the German climate law, which said that German governments have to take into account the impact of their climate action on people elsewhere in the world. They also said that the German government has to think about the interests of future German voters and not allow the interests of current German voters to be traded off against those future voters.
I love this idea. Democracy with a longer horizon. Not just reacting to today's voters, but to tomorrow's citizens too. And then there's the most talked about democratic innovation right now, citizens' assemblies. A way for ordinary people to directly shape policy after learning, debating, and weighing trade-off. Basically the opposite of what happens on X. Heather had more to say about that.
But fundamentally, we need to have reforms to the way that we engage in democracy, like citizens' assemblies. These have been used rather effectively in some European countries, for example, Ireland, France, Poland, but also outside Europe in Canada and New Zealand, where citizens' assemblies have allowed citizens to take part directly in deliberative processes to decide on issues like whether to have a new runway at an airport, whether to build a dam, or whether to change the constitution. It allows a really deliberative process where people can learn from experts and hear a wide range of opinions on the topic. They can deliberate among themselves and they can come out with solutions. And those exercises are really interesting because on climate in particular, we see that ordinary voters, citizens in these assemblies, often come out with much more forward thinking and intergenerational solutions for climate action than governments do.
So no, these new forms of participation don't replace elections. And they certainly don't replace electoral legitimacy, but they do expand the democratic space. They show that participation is not dying, it's diversifying. But there is another side to all of this that we need to look at. Because disengagement isn't only about personal choice or generational habits. It's also deeply social. The people who walk away from elections are often the ones who were already least represented to begin with. That's also where disengagement becomes dangerous, because it creates a representation gap. So before looking at new solutions, we need to understand this social fallout. Let's start with something the data shows very clearly. Exclusion breeds disengagement. And to understand what that means in real life, it helps to look at one very simple example. In the 2019 European elections, about 400,000 people with disabilities in 14 European countries weren't allowed to vote because they were under guardianship. And even when people do have the right to vote, the way voting is organized can still push them out. Maybe the booth isn't wide enough for someone in a wheelchair to cast a secret ballot. Maybe there is no easy-to-read information for blind or low-vision voters. Or maybe you can't fill out the ballot because you need to write with a pen. Each of those can quietly close the door to someone's participation in politics. And this logic goes well beyond election day. participation also depends on the wider environment we call civic space. That's the environment that allows citizens and civil society organizations to take part freely in public life. And here too, when civic space shrinks, disengagement grows. Most civil society organizations in the EU depend heavily on public funding. So it's sadly no surprise that when democracy comes under pressure, they're often the first to see their budgets cut. Over the past decade, national public funding has dropped significantly in at least 10 EU member states. Hungary, Poland, Italy, Croatia, Slovakia, and these cuts rarely fall evenly. They often hit advocacy groups, media watchdogs, and organizations working on rights and inclusion, the ones that actually help keep participation open and pluralistic. And in places where these cuts have gone hand in hand with democratic backsliding, Hungary being a well-documented example, funding hasn't only been reduced, it's been redirected toward organizations that are politically friendly to the government, so that further weakens the independent voices that keep civic space alive. This is why I find Daniela's point so important. Participation needs nourishment. It does not survive on its own.
All political actors and societies in Europe should always have in mind that some kind of civic engagement is very necessary and useful also for our democracy in general. So we should not cut the money when it comes to civic engagement, but to really provide more money to sustain the level of civic engagement that is out there.
She's absolutely right. When you cut support for civic engagement, groups who already feel left out can drift even further away. And that has real consequences for democratic resilience. Take Hungary again. In 2018, the National Democratic Institute published a report showing that political disinterest among young people is now at its highest level since 2000, with only 1 in 10 saying they're interested in political topics. And this doesn't come out of nowhere. It's tied to a lack of meaningful public dialogue, to widespread mistrust of institutions, and to an education system that avoids sensitive political issues altogether, sometimes just to avoid trouble or funding cuts. So no, low engagement doesn't automatically cause democratic backsliding, but it certainly makes it easier. And sometimes the distance between what people believe and how they vote becomes enormous. This gap between social engagement and electoral behavior shows up in many areas. But climate politics is one of the clearest examples. When I spoke with Heather, she explained it in very concrete terms.
You can see that local level initiatives which bring direct benefits to the local community really can have an impact. And people enjoy getting involved in those kinds of things. You can also see the way that youth mobilization, when it's widely reported on in the media, invites more mobilization. Where we get back to the difficulty with representative democracy is that if this doesn't translate into votes for particular parties, it's quite hard to get elected representatives to take it seriously. So, for example, our research found that around 80% of Europeans want more climate action. And yet we also see in some of the largest economies in Europe, Germany, France, Italy, also the UK, parties which are against green measures have between 25 and 30% support in the polls. So that's a real contrast. You have a consensus in favor of climate action, but people vote on other issues. For many of them, climate is in their top 3 or top 4 issues, but they're going to vote for parties that are offering to deal with maybe their number 1 issue, which could be the cost of living, inflation, or it could be around jobs, or it might be around migration. And there's, I think, a just diminishing trust in mainstream parties to deliver a transition to a climate neutral economy.
Heather's example points to something that goes way beyond climate politics. When people really care about an issue but don't see it show up in what parties are offering, a gap opens up. Across Europe, it's pretty clear that most people want stronger action on climate change. In 2025, and that's according to a Eurobarometer survey, 85% of Europeans think tackling climate change should be a priority, and almost 9 in 10 want the EU to do more on renewable energy and energy efficiency. That support is real, but as usual, it's not the same everywhere. In places like Malta and Sweden, support for the goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050 reaches more than 90%. But in countries such as Czechia and Estonia, it drops to around half of the population, or even less. But politicians often focus on the issues voters rank as their number one priority, not those where there is a broader but quieter agreement. Over time, not seeing their concerns reflected in the political debate can make some people feel that politics is not really responding to them, and especially for already underrepresented groups. So the real question is, how do we bridge that gap? How do we make sure people's engagement actually carries weight? So if people care and they act and they show up in all kinds of ways, what would it actually take for participation to feel meaningful again? Well, the evidence here is actually pretty encouraging. Petition signing has basically become part of everyday politics in a lot of countries. Boycotting products or brands is now pretty common too, with around 1 in 5 people saying they've done it. Demonstrations go up and down depending on the context, but there is no big long-term decline. And even though fewer people contact politicians directly, that number has stayed surprisingly stable for about 20 years. So the issue is not that people are not participating. It's that they're choosing ways of doing it that give them more agency, more clarity, and frankly, more voice than a ballot alone. And that's exactly where Ophélie brings in something essential. Before we get into institutions or processes, she goes back to one essential point. People do not expect democracy to be fast. They expect it to be responsive.
If you want to consult anybody, that is always going to take a lot more time than if you had to decide on anything yourself. That applies at even individual level, but that also applies at collective level. So it is bound to be slow. Then the question is, do we have the space for these potentially needed changes? Because I don't think that the main problem with democracy is that it's slow, like we need to discuss and voice that we're not agreeing and so on. I think it's more about how effective they are, more than how fast they are. How much it delivers on making people feel that there is space for their voice to be heard.
So if you believe your contribution is taken seriously, even if it takes a while to see any result, you stay engaged. But if you get the feeling that nothing you say makes a difference, you can drift away. And that brings us to empowerment, which Heather explained in a very concrete way.
When people feel empowered that their action can make a difference, they're willing to do a lot of action and even to make sacrifices in their own lives. And I think one of the key things that could really help with democratic participation for the climate action to be a collective effort, which is linked up with democratic participation, is for those in authority, so governments, but people in authority also in schools and so on, to give opportunities for action and to create empowerment. What's really frustrating for everyone is when you hear worse and worse news about the climate and more impacts that affect your life and affect your economy and affect your job and affect your community and affect your children. And you feel like there's nothing I can do. Nobody's taking action.
Her point is actually really simple. People are ready to act, even to change their habits, when they feel their actions are part of something bigger. And that feeling almost never starts at the national level. It comes from what they see right around them, in their neighborhood, in their workplaces, in their schools, where they can actually see the impact. So making participation meaningful again isn't about telling people to get more involved. They already are. It's about building the conditions where what they do genuinely matters. Real civic space, steady support for civil society, and institutions that treat participation as an ongoing conversation, not a box-ticking exercise every few years. So the real question isn't, how do we get people to participate? It's, how do we reshape participation so people can recognize themselves in it again? Because that's when democracy starts feeling like something you're part of, not something that just happens around you. And that's where we'll wrap up this fourth episode. When you put all of this together, it becomes pretty clear. People haven't stopped trying to participate. Not at all. What's fading is the belief that participation actually leads somewhere. And that's the real challenge for democracies today, this gap between what people do and what they see reflected back. And as surprising as it might sound, there is no simple link between participation and political trust. For some, taking action builds trust. For others, it's a way of showing frustration. So it's all about how participation plays out. At the end of the day, it really comes down to something simple. People want to feel heard. Maybe the real upgrade we need is in how our democracies listen and how they respond. Which leads to the next big question. If participation is changing, can our institutions change with it? In the next episode, we will dive into whether democracy itself needs an upgrade and how it can become more responsive without losing the stability that keeps it standing. And before we close, a quick reminder. Democracy Cracks is produced by TEPSA as part of the Horizon Europe project ActEU. I'm Eva Ribera, Program Manager at TEPSA, and I'm the one behind this series. If you're curious about the data, studies, or research that inform what you've heard today, you will find all the references in the episode description. And if anything in this episode made you think, smile, question, or disagree, please reach out. I'm always happy to hear from you. See you next time.